When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite, looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, the profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
This is wrestling writer and podcaster Brian R. Solomon telling you to listen to Crazy Train Radio.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, the Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, not going to do the whole spiel, but to our wrestling audience, his name is synonymous with the classic Blood and Fire book, which is about the original Sheik out of Detroit. He also was a former WWE magazine writer and was with the company for many years. But he has a new book out, Irresistible Force, The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon.
Gentlemen, I have this gentleman who's saying he has a reservation. We're sold out. I don't have anything for him. He's giving me problems.
Hey, Joey, how you doing?
Oh,
how you doing, Ed? Oh, no, not you. Hi, Ern. How are you?
Oh, I'm having
trouble
here
with her. Let me straighten this whole situation out for you guys. I appreciate it. I'll work on this piece of work.
Mr. Monsoon, excuse me. He's telling me he has a reservation. I don't have anything on.
Miss Betty made it for me. Miss Betty?
Yes.
Do you have a suite? You have my suite ready,
Sure,
is it?
of course.
Whoa. You've got a suite for him and you got nothing for me but a hat?
Wait a minute. Don't get excited. Do you have a rollaway?
Yes.
That you could possibly
Oh,
stick
you're
it
too
in?
big for a rollaway.
No, the rollaway's for you. I'll stick it right in the corner of the suite.
Don't stick me in a corner like an Airedale. I'm not
See,
too
I
big
don't
to be in a
depend on
rollaway.
this, Betty, to make my reservation. Every time we come to Atlantic City, you embarrass me, you embarrass the World Wrestling Federation, you've obviously embarrassed this young lady here. Folks, while I straighten this situation out right now, let's take it to this most interesting tag team matchup. Killer Bees taking on the Conquistadors.
How big's the rollaway?
What's the difference? How big is
The writer and author, Brian R. Solomon. Brian, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Glad to be back on the show. Thank you.
And I will not admit publicly that I may have beaten a person or two with the size of the book.
You could cause a lot of damage with it. Yeah, it's good for holding doors open too.
Bret Hart like.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, we're not going Goldberg Hart, but so Brian, as of this taping, it was a few days ago, you had your official launch party on the 5th, right?
Yeah.
How did that go?
Oh, it was great. It was really great. We had it at a brewery here in Connecticut in Fairfield. The Morella family came up from New Jersey, Gorilla's daughters, Valerie and Sharon, and their husbands, and a couple of the grandkids, Gino and Joey, who are the twin boys of Valerie. Gino Morella and Joey Morella are their names. And it was great having them. And we had Tom Burke show up with his whole Massachusetts crew. Just lots of support and lots of listeners to my podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle. So it was a blast.
Right on. Dr. Mike, you're with us, and we were kind of talking about it before and as Brian was coming in the room. And I did confirm that Brian has said to me, because I stopped by the appearance in Wilmbo with some books to have signed, but Brian gives you all the credit for that light bulb going off. So I'll let you start the honor, sir.
Well, I couldn't remember if it was on this show or another one that I co-host and do, regularly and love doing.
I think it might have been with Evan. Was it
with Evan? Yeah, maybe it was the other one. But I know and respect. There's a very small handful. I mean, Tom Burke is like the surviving. He and George Shire are like the surviving historian gods. We lost J. Michael Kenyon and quite a few others that were big deals. Steve Yohe and I are kind of on a little level below that. But I mean, Tom Burke is the god of that. And George, too, with the wisdom Napolitano that he's had. But I knew you would do the research. So it was, I don't know how it came up, but I said, after the Chic book and all of your, magnificent book, Wrestling and otherwise, I said, you got to do it either on Monsoon, Goldust Trio, or Vince Sr. And I was kind of pushing for Vince Sr., which I'll push now specifically here on Crazy Train Radio. I think it has to be told. I think there's a lot of cool stuff. Sadly, I think Juanita passed, but I mean, there's a lot of legends. I mean, Gene and Steve Stanley that you would do. I mean, nobody does the research that Brian Solomon does. He already has that love of the biz oozing out of his pores, and does the the microfishing and all of the stuff that is so labor intensive to put out a book of this quality and on someone so important. So many levels in wrestling that a lot of people don't know except X amount. The Gino Morella was, as this world class. I mean, God, the stuff he did in Los Angeles alone in the '60s, prior to try to be and hang with Morales before he was like sort of the Arnold Skolin to Pedro Morales, the way Arnie was to Bruno.
Yeah, and that California period is often forgotten. It's not talked about. People tend to think, okay, he showed up in the WWF in '63 and he never left. And that's not true. I mean, he did have that agreement with them that he was coming back, but he was, 65 and 66. He was out on the West Coast, North and South, as you know well. And he did a lot. He got married out there. They had their daughter out there. I mean, a lot of important things happened there. So, I mean, I had to cover that thoroughly in the book, and I tried to, not to mention a couple of times in the '70s when he came back, to help out here and there with a shot or two.
And running towns. I mean, I wish I tried to pepper you with a lot of photos. I finally found some negatives with him and Phil Zacco, sort of behind the scenes. So anybody who knows Phil Zacco, that was an experience, yelling and screaming and kids, get away from the ring and all the stuff that Phil did. I wasn't there extensively, but I got to spend like many summers in New York and would just like with John Arrizzi, we would hit and go to as many, Vince shows and then the IWA, Eddie Einhorn thing, that Money Mark, who a decade after the IWA in the 70s, he money marked and fronted money, lost a fortune, as he told me on Pro Wrestling USA, they had those great shows at the Meadowlands combining NWA and AWA talent. You can see the world titles of both on the same card, those magnificent shows. And he was a co-owner of the Chicago White Sox, this billionaire, very Tony Khan-like, but
Well, he
decades before.
popularized March Madness. I mean, that was his creation,
Good.
getting college basketball as a viable television entity. That was really his claim to fame. I guess the money he lost on the IWA in the 70s wasn't enough. He had to lose more in the 80s. But I think he should have stayed in his lane. That's the problem. He didn't really know what he was getting involved with wrestling, but you think he would have learned his lesson. I don't know.
I was at a CAC. I nagged him to come and got some IWA guys there, like the Love Brothers before. I forget which one we lost. It was Hartford or Reginald, who were a big part of that. But that was a super group. It wasn't just Sheik and Johnny Powers, Pedro Martinez, NWF guys. It was, everybody. And I think I've told you a million times who we saw backstage at the very first of three Roosevelt Stadium, New Jersey shows. Uh, Johnny Powers came and brought his gear. You always bring your gear, that goes back 100 years. But he brings Inoki, his partner, who he then sells the NWF singles and tag titles to when NWF folded, whatever it was, 75, 74. Thez was there, did bring his gear. He ended up reffing, I believe, on that first show and wrestling on the second and third of the three Roosevelt, the big, huge outdoor stadium, Roosevelt Stadium shows. Ricky Starr, Thez then brings Ricky Starr, who people hadn't seen in years.
Right.
He didn't have his
He's living
ballet
in
shoes.
Europe.
Yeah, but he had a ponytail, and there were many others back there. The rumors that Muchnick and the Sheik Eddie Farhat were backstage. I did not see them. I would have, but people, others had spread that. But let me throw back to Jonathan. But just the stuff in LA with Monsoon alone, when you had Crybaby George Cannon and Tarzan Tyler and Crazy Luke Graham, in his infancy, he wasn't even part of, and they didn't even barely talk about the Graham brothers, who was more so Vince Senior guys, the first guys on the cover of Stan Weston's Wrestling Review in '59, which I think is still the most highly prized magazine and magazine cover.
And Gorilla and Crazy Luke Graham, they were a steady tag team out there too. Held the title.
Yeah, but we're not, and throw in Monsoon hanging around John Tolis and obviously Freddie Blassie, our greatest heel of all time, who the Sheik in three cage matches in 1970 then turned babyface. And then to cement it, and I'll shut up, throw back to Jonathan, Blassie goes to Rocky Johnson on camera, who is then our America's Tag Champs with Bobo. And Blassie says, look, Rocky, I want to have a scientific match with you. And if I do any underhanded tactics, that was his way of saying healing, I will leave the territory. I will leave, I'll just force myself out of here. And it went to 45-minute Broadway. And Blassie actually was doing holds like you wouldn't even see from Sheik Farhat. They could do everything, but they were locked into their gimmick. And such a wonderful period of time. And then Monsoon coming in to save in 1973. But I'll shut up and throw it to Jonathan.
Well, actually, there's two quick things I wanted to say about those 60s California runs that he had, that Gorilla had. Two interesting things, which you may know, Mike, is that during that little window that Gorilla was out there, like a year and a half, less than 2 years, Blassie was not there for that. You would have thought that would have been where they got to know each other. But that was the period where Freddie was selling cars. He had stepped away for a brief moment. I think it was health related, and he was literally, another job he was well suited for. He was selling used cars, and so they actually didn't. He wasn't there at the time. He was there before, and he was there after. The other thing was California was where Gorilla first started using Wild Red Berry as his manager, not New
Oh
York,
yeah.
because Bobby Davis had been his manager in New York the first time, 63, 64. And he knew, I mean, Wild Red Berry was part of the Capitol office in New York, but he wasn't Gorilla's manager. And they sent him out to California to keep an eye on Gorilla and take care of him during the time he would be out there. And actually, he also, Red Berry, whose real name was Fred Berry, but he and his wife were the witnesses at Gino and Maureen's wedding. And then when they came back to New York, they had Berry, because Davis was out of the business, they had Berry be his manager. And he's really much better remembered as Gorilla's manager more than Bobby Davis was. So just wanted to add that in there about California.
He did some films. They brought him. He didn't get on camera for the film Mighty Joe Young, which had Howard Hughes' wife almost at the time or later, Terry Moore in it, who we honored at Cauliflower Alley. But Red Berry was like behind the scenes and pulling ribs and keeping the wrestlers that were there, like Super Swedish Angel, etc. I think Primo Carnera, entertained at that shoot. Everybody loved and has a Wild Red Berry story here in LA.
That's great. That's great.
And
Well,
I think, wasn't he in Alias the Champ, Gorgeous George's movie from
You
like
know what? I don't know. I need to see that movie. I've never seen it. I don't know if he was in it or not. John, I think, John, you were going to say something, right?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I was just going to go back to the book comparison per se. And, well, first off, and I noticed this when it came in, the look of the cover. It almost has like this weird optic thing. Was that a choice of yours?
The embossing, I had no idea about. I'm glad about it. It looks great.
Yeah.
To do that, because that just shows an extra level of care in putting it together. I love the embossing and the whole kind of Vegas background. That was something I wanted, because we were trying to think of how should the cover look. And I'll tell you the truth. I told them specifically, so many wrestling books, they do the cover where it's supposed to look like an old fight poster, which is great, but like that's been done so many times. Or it's supposed to look like an old wrestling magazine cover. So I said, let's not do that. Let's do something totally different. And so I came up with the idea of, because, he was all about Vegas, Atlantic City, the casinos in Puerto Rico. I said, do something glitzy, Vegasy in the background. And the other thing that was driving me nuts was the font for the letters on the front. Like, how should that look? And I had a great suggestion from a friend of mine, Brian Kuntzman, who is an NXT producer currently and a huge fan of wrestling history. And he suggested using the font that was used on WWF TV in the 80s for putting the names on the screen of the wrestlers and the announcers and things, which is what we wound up doing, and I think it came out great.
Absolutely. And the big difference between this and Blood and Fire, and I would think you'd agree with this, obviously. The big difference is you had involvement with the family.
Yes.
For this book, which is, you get so much more accurate information, I would think. But talk about getting the family involved.
Yeah, that made a big difference. It's also why the book is so much longer, because there was so much more material that I got. And with the involvement of the family, even pictures, so many great pictures. That happened. Look, I approached them the same way I did with the Farhat family, except the Morellas were thrilled. So it was a night and day kind of difference. I found Valerie first, and I'd seen her on Facebook and things in some of the wrestling groups, and I kind of looked her up and found out how to contact her directly. And it's interesting. In the beginning, there was definitely caution. They didn't know me. She went and brought it to her mother, Maureen, and who was around at the time. Maureen, even more cautious, very private person. Gino was a private person and just reluctant until the more I talked to them, and I was not persuading, I was not being pushy, but just the more I communicated with them, the more they saw that I was acting in good faith, that I knew my stuff, that I wasn't a lunatic. And they started to get really warmed up to it. And I think one of the turning points was I came for a visit. I visited Maureen in New Jersey. She was in assisted living at the time. And Valerie came down with her husband, Ed. And on that day, I think I really, really showed her that it was okay to trust me. And we had such a great conversation. They showed me photos and things. I was sitting there going through photo albums with them, helping them to identify people in the photos that they didn't know who they were, and clarifying things about Gino's life and stuff. And from that point on, we had the greatest relationship ever. Valerie told me after I left that day, she had a conversation with her mother, and her mother was like, boy, he really knows his stuff, and he's a nice guy. We should work with him. And they did, and it took the book, like you said, to a whole other level. Then the Sheik book, I enjoyed writing, and I stand by it, and I think it turned out really, really great. But I think it could have been even better if I had the Farhats, involved in it.
So let's go with the entire process. Obviously, Mike hit a light bulb off in your head. You do some research, get the family's blessing. Okay, I'm gonna run with this now. How long of a process to put this book together for you?
Well, first thing, I just want to say one quick thing about the family too, is that there's a big asterisk next to that, which has to be mentioned. The problem with family involvement, and this came up with the Sheik book, is you also don't want them to dictate what the book is taking it over. Like I always say, and I said this to Eddie Farhat Jr., rest his soul, I said, if you want to have this much control and get money out of it and everything, you need to do your own book. This is my book. This is my project. I'm writing it, So what helped in getting family involvement for this book was the fact that, Gino didn't have the skeletons in the closet that Sheik had. There weren't deep, dark secrets that the family was trying to hide. So, which I respect that. I understand that rationale. So that, I think, greased the wheels a little bit too. That it was much more of a positive experience. They had nothing to hide. Valerie said to me from the beginning, she goes, look, if you're looking for skeletons and dark things, I'm going to just lay it out to you right now. He smoked. He loved to gamble. He ate too much. And he was married once before Maureen. That's it. You're never going to find anything else. And she was 100% right. I mean, there was really, this isn't a book of dirt. But as far as the process, I mean, it takes a long time. People don't realize how long these things take. And I get to devote way more time to it, I think, than most people who write these books, because, I don't have a traditional 9 to 5, Monday to Friday office job or something. Like, I teach part-time, I do freelance writing and podcasting and stuff from home. So I'm able to really, when I'm barreling through this, I'm working almost like 8-hour days on the book. But so, I mean, it took me a total of 3 years from the time I pitched it to the time it came out. And it probably would have taken twice that long if I was only working part-time on it. But you start out doing all your interviews, figuring out who you want to talk to. That gives you the skeleton of the story. You get a feel for the person. You start digging into archives and research, newspapers.com, ancestry.com, checking out, the wealth of reference material that's out there now. That's incredible. I mean, you can go, it's obviously far from complete, but you can go on things like Cage Match and Wrestling Data, and you can get a feel for where they were traveling to, what they were doing, where they were on the card, those kind of things. Plus, I had access to people that worked at WWE in the past, because I did as well. So I knew them, people that had worked with Gino. And to be honest, like I signed the deal for it in November 2022. And I did not write a single word until probably the middle of the summer of the next year. So, I mean, I took my time, because the last thing you want to do is start writing before you have a full picture of the life story you're trying to tell, because then you just wind up with a list of facts. So I really let it simmer first before I jumped in.
Well, I'm going to throw back to Mike in a second, but you just mentioned signing your deal with ECW Press,
yes,
etc., which they are wonderful folks there over there. Great, so many great books come out of there. But did they put any pressure on you to say, hey, Brian, as far as when you were, like you said, you signed in November and you didn't start writing until the summer?
No pressure at all. Quite the opposite. Part of it was that they trusted me because of the Sheik book. That's partly why they immediately greenlit the book. Like, they didn't even need a pitch from me, a sample, nothing. I just said, hey, I'm thinking about doing a Gorilla Monsoon book. And they said, let's do it immediately, right then and there. And they got the paperwork together. So I was really lucky. And as far as like, they trusted me to get it done. They gave me my deadlines. And here's the thing, John, it was like, I blew every deadline and they didn't care. My original deadline to get it finished and written was May of 2024. And I didn't finish it until September. And I almost blew that one. They gave me a September deadline and I almost blew that one. And then on top of that, it came to about 100 pages over their original length limit. So, but this was because I spoke to them and they said, Mike Holmes there, the excellent editorial director there, he goes, look, this is not hard and fast. This is somebody, he was a big man who led a big life. It can be a big book. Take your time, make it right. You could forget, don't worry about the deadlines. We'll work it out. The only thing that happened with blowing the deadline is that the book came out later. So originally they were shooting for spring of this year to time it with WrestleMania. And so instead it's now kind of leading into the holiday season a little bit later. So, I mean, but that's it. I think it's a much better book than it would have been if I rushed it. So it's all good.
Dr. Mike, do you want to jump in here?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I've emailed you this. What a magnificent title, because it reminds people of his most famous catchphrase, and he had a lot, packed to the rafters and the atmosphere here and blah blah blah.
Cut it with a knife.
Taking just a bite of that famous saying and having that as the brilliant title. I marked out for the title just seeing it, hearing about it before I even saw it. Yeah, obviously we love ECW Press, and a lot of folks I got to interview at a NAPTY. No, I don't think it was a NAPTY TV convention, but something where Bruno was still with the company. It wasn't too long after WrestleMania 1 with Gino, and they talked about, because Danucci was there too. So Danucci's saying, oh, my happiest times of my life are traveling to Japan and all across the US and Toronto for Tunney at Maple Leaf with Bruno. That's Dominic and Bruno, but Gino and Monsoon and Bruno talking about going to Puerto Rico and other places. Just because those guys were tight. Maybe not as tight as Dominic and Bruno were, but I'm looking at some of my notes. I'm pretty sure I'd have to research because I haven't been able to read the whole book yet. But in Los Angeles, when Gino was there, I think towards the end, that's when Dr. Sam Shepard and his father-in-law came in. And this is the guy, for people that don't know, fueled the David Jansen amazing TV show, which before MASH's conclusion had the highest TV ratings on the planet for the finale with a one-armed man. And then the Harrison Ford movie to follow decades later. But this guy, I remember asking Monsoon some questions about Sam Shepard, and he goes, the guy was kind of a creep. The boys didn't really want to have something to do with an outsider there, because Monsoon had felt that while he was in Los Angeles when some of the LA Rams, when the season was over, they weren't making, they were like Willie Mays. Sometimes in his life, just making 20,000. And even based on today's dollar value, that was nothing for, Willie Mays, for example, in San Francisco, because I never missed a Dodgers Giants game in the 60s. But so guys like Don Chewy and Don, I think his name was Don Corolla from the Rams, their offseason, they would come in and wrestle. And later on, a couple of years later, when Monsoon came into LA in 73, he said he told me in the back, this guy is the drizzling shits, Dwayne Allen, a Ram who also tried to pilfer off. And this is a guy who Fred Blassie took a dump in his gym bag. So the boys did not like these outsiders. People are talking about Logan Paul and blah, blah, blah.
Well, it's different now.
These guys now that come in from outside world, you respect them because they put in the time at the Performance Center.
They're fans. The celebrities or outsiders back then, they held their nose. It was different,
Yeah.
But the thing, it's funny you say that about Monsoon and how he felt. That's an ongoing thing with him specifically. He never liked getting people involved who were not part of the business. He always got concerned about it. He was against the Ali thing, which of course he went along with because he was loyal. but he was against that idea. He wasn't thrilled about what was the other one? Oh, one of the last things that he ever did, and it's mentioned at the beginning of the book, was the Brawl for All. He was not a fan of that. He was disgusted. And in fact, if you watch really closely, it's hard to miss when you watch this Brawl for All thing that he was supposedly the judge for. It was his last public appearance, but it's Bart Gunn and Butterbean. And Bart Gunn's basically being fed to this guy as punishment. He's just being tossed into a wood chipper, basically. And Monsoon's there at ringside. And when Bart Gunn gets knocked out after like seconds into it, he crumples down to the mat. You could actually see Monsoon, who is not doing well. He's frail and thin. You see him get up from the judges' table out of the corner. You can barely catch it, but he leans into the ring and he puts his hands on Bart, and you could mouth read, and he's saying to him, "Are you okay? Are you all right?" And he is the one, as frail as he is, who helps Bart Gunn to the back after the thing happens. And, he was just not a fan of getting these untrained people involved at all. Just not into that at all. Yeah.
That reminds me too of the thought behind in the New Japan locker room when I was there, when they brought in some of those Russian great athletes, legit grapplers, but no pro wrestling experience. They had no connection with the crowd, and the boys really despised it because they were having to look bad. If you throw like Liger's best opponent, Naoki Sano, against one of these big, huge Sambo champions, and they get squashed, legit, the audience wasn't doing well, and Inoki finally got rid of it. That was one of his many 9 life situations. What else was I going to look at here? I was going to ask.
I was just one thing I wanted to mention, because you talked about talking to Bruno and Gorilla about Puerto Rico. I would have killed to have a chance to sit down with them and mention that, because I get into it in the book how fans didn't know about this. And at the time, in mainland United States and Canada, 1978, those guys went at it again. They had their last in-ring feud, their last matches took place down there over the North American title. They wrestled something like 7, 8, 9 times in all the different towns down there. They traded the title back and forth. In fact, Gorilla actually got to go over one time on Bruno, not counting countouts and all that stuff. He went over Bruno for the title, but the caveat was it was a chain match, so there was no pinfall. It was just tag the 4 turnbuckles. But that was the only time ever in the hundreds of matches that they had that Gino actually went over.
Funny that you mentioned the Brawl Fall at the WrestleMania 15 in Philly. Is it Total Karma or whatever you want to get? Even though that was the shits, the match and promotion for that itself. But was it kind of like the gods or whatever looking down on Gino for his last appearance to be in Philadelphia because of the history of the area and such?
Well, that was, it was serendipity, because that's
the word I was looking for.
That's the thing. He lived there, so it was easy. They were having it right in his backyard. What a lot of people don't understand or realize at the time, now he was, he had been the president, quote unquote, of the WWF for a couple of years. In the summer of 97, he had a massive heart attack that he never really fully got over, and they took him off TV at that point. So he hadn't been seen for a year and a half. But the thing was, he was still around. He took about half a year off. But by the beginning of 98, they weren't putting him on TV, but he was still coming to all the local shows, to the local TVs and things. He'd be backstage at Monday Night Raw, during the Attitude Era, all that stuff. It's just people didn't know that because he wasn't being put out there. So the Philly thing was kind of a no-brainer, because, like, for example, the year before in Boston, right, WrestleMania 14, he was there too, but he just wasn't introduced to the crowd. He just stayed in the back. So this time, and I think it was because everybody knew, that he didn't have much time left. He made the choice. He knew he was going to die. They wanted to put him on dialysis. He said no. He knew he was on borrowed time. So it really was like a chance to say goodbye, that at the time people may not have known fully, but that's what it was.
Absolutely. And that has a lot. I know this story's been told, but that has a lot to do with his son Joey's passing. Correct? That he was, as far as his uh mentality going. You know what? Do I really care anymore? Like
Yeah,
it
it
to
had
exist.
everything. It had everything to do with it because he was at least having fun before that. I mean, he was, working with Bobby Heenan. He was a vital part of Vince's expansion, going into all the different markets because he knew everybody. Everybody knew and respected him. They didn't know and respect Vince in the beginning. They just thought he was the snot-nosed kid, the son of a man that they did respect. But by sending Gino in there, it was important. He knew Stu Hart. He knew Paul Bosch. He knew, those guys. He could go in those places and smooth things over. So he had been doing that. And then when he lost Joey, that really is it. I mean, everybody said the same exact thing to me. He lost all his enthusiasm for the business. He stopped caring. He could turn it on when he was on camera, but that was it. And then after that, he was just all business. And you start to see that because he really does start to fade away. Like the thing about becoming the president, let's be the real side of that is what that is you don't have to really, it's a much less demanding job. You're not calling the matches. You're not constantly on television. You don't have to be at every taping. Basically, you come out every couple of weeks, you come out on TV, you make some kind of proclamation for 5 minutes, you go backstage again and go back to playing cards with Arnie Skolin and Pat Patterson. I mean, that was like a gift to him because they knew that his energies were dissipating. So, he was done. He was done.
Yeah. Well, speaking of playing cards with Arnie, and you guys were talking about California and such, but the Roosevelt Stadium show that really kicked things off for him in the
Yeah.
63 to 65 time frame as far
Yeah,
as
it
being a
was.
mainstay.
It was. I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to bring it up when Dr. Mike was just talking about Roosevelt Stadium before. And that's 10 years later, right? They were doing the IWA shows there, but in 63, that is the match that put Gorilla Monsoon on the map and made him almost overnight into a main event heel and a top attraction because he had been bouncing around for 3 years, going to different places, mid card, or maybe occasional main events because he was so huge, he would be easy to plug in, but not a known commodity, not a major star. And he wound up in July 63 in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation thanks to Killer Kowalski, who he got to know in Japan, who kind of made the introductions and things. They were looking for somebody because Bruno had just won the title from Buddy Rogers. He needed strong opponents. They were going to lean into doing a rematch series with Buddy. But as a lot of people know, Buddy had health issues. Buddy was also difficult to deal with, very political. There were rumors that he was trying to steal the promotion out from under Vince Sr. So they had buyer's remorse, and they were looking for somebody to replace Buddy Rogers. That turned out to be Gorilla Monsoon. And they gave him everything. He had been Gino Morella before that. He had been the smiling, happy Italian-American, singing opera before his matches and things like that. And they gave him that Vince Sr. took one look at him. And Gorilla Monsoon, I'm sure it was helpful that it had the same initials, so you didn't have to change your gear like a lot of guys would try to do back then. But gave him the name, gave him the gimmick. You don't talk, you're a mute, you're a savage. We're going to put you with Bobby Davis. And he became instantly hot. The Roosevelt Field match, Roosevelt Stadium, wound up being, I think they built it up. I think they had it in October. It had been building it up for a couple of months, and it was originally advertised as San Martino versus Rogers. In fact, San Martino versus Rogers says that on the ticket stubs that still exist. But that match, it was not the longest match, and it was one of those things that ends in a DQ, complete riot finish, police coming in the ring, blood and chairs going everywhere. But it made him the talk of that company right away. And then he got plugged in, like you said, before he went to California, an initial feud that went from late 63 into mid 64. They had 4 main events at Madison Square Garden. And then they started taking it around the other markets. for the rest of 64 and going into 65. And, at that point, if you look at the numbers, I know Meltzer's reported it and things like that. He was, for that moment in time, the top drawing heel, he and the Sheik, the top drawing heels in wrestling. And he's getting in all the wrestling magazines because it's New York, the story, and the magazines are all right there. And that was off to the races. So he went to California. Then when he came back, they started it up right again. He comes back in 67. Now he's got Wild Red Berry. He's like 25 pounds bigger even than he was before. And they start doing it again. They have a 3-match series at the Garden and going all over the place. That they wound up having 4 straight matches at the Philadelphia Arena. And actually, the other thing was in 64, and this is what made him too, just as much as the Roosevelt Stadium match. In 64, they had their 70-minute curfew draw at the Garden. And I wrote in the book that is really where he became a made man. The fact that he pulled that off, a 70-minute draw, which then as now was pretty rare. I mean, they don't do that in WWE. They just don't do those big time limit draws. It's not a thing. And even back then, it wasn't that common. And they really turned a lot of heads with that. That was a major. Both of those guys would always call that the best match of their career. Both of them. So
now, before I throw it back to Mike, where with this whole Roosevelt Stadium and the rivalry with Bruno, etc., where does the involvement with Bill Watts slide in time frame wise?
You asking me or Mike?
I'm asking you, Brian.
Well, the Bill Watts thing was 65. So it happened before he went to California. And actually, he and Watts met again out in California where they had, Watts was back to being a face out there and Gorilla was the heel, and they were trading what was the title? The United States title in the Roy Shire promotion. But in New York, as people may know, they had Watts come in. He came in from Leroy McGurk. Wild Red Berry he was originally from Kansas, I think, and he had gone back home to visit family. And while he was down there, he visited with Leroy McGurk, and he got a feel for Bill Watts, and he thought he'd be a great fit, and he brought him to the attention of Vince Sr. And what they did was they brought him in as the number 2 babyface. He was like Bruno's pal, Bruno's helper. It was sort of like, the Italian and the Cowboy. It was like this interesting combination. But the plan was, I don't think the plan originally was to turn him. So there's a whole thing in the book about, this is another Buddy Rogers thing. Buddy Rogers, around that time, he was trying to kind of worm his way back into the company again. He wanted to get the title back, and he was still trying to kind of take over the territory. And he made a deal. He tried to make a deal with Watts. He said to him, look, I'll be your manager, right? And we'll do this whole thing where like you turn on Bruno, you win the title from Bruno, and then I turn on you. You become a babyface again, and then I beat you for the title. So it was all this roundabout way for Buddy to get the belt back. So Watts went to Bruno with this because Watts and Bruno had become great friends, dear friends, and he felt really bad about potentially betraying him, his trust. And they were workout buddies. They were both gym freaks, the two of them. And Watts went to Bruno and said, look, this is what Buddy approached me with, what he wants me to do. Bruno went to Vince. Obviously, the whole thing got killed. But as a reward to Bill Watts for loyalty, they turned him heel and they put him in big money matches with Bruno because they knew how much money he would make at the top of the card. Because in those days, you weren't going to be in main events unless you were a heel because Bruno was the only guy, So Watts became the top heel. And then what they did to cement the heel turn was they had Watts, who had been Bruno's best friend, joining forces with Gorilla Monsoon, who was Bruno's worst enemy. So that was kind of like the alliance, and they wound up winning the title, which was back then called the United States Tag Team title. They had a little run with that. And then, like I said, in a few months, they were both in California.
Dr. Mike?
Okay, I'm going to run through a lot of stuff very quickly. Watts was proudly, anytime I interviewed him, he said he thought he learned at the feet of the greatest booking minds, from Vince Sr. to Roy Shire, his time in San Francisco, which was significant, hanging and driving to shows with Ray Stevens and Pepper Gomez, Gagne, when he was in there in the AWA, Jules Strongbow, our genius booker in the Los Angeles, Baba, when he toured Japan, both the Ricky Dozan promotion, later All Japan. Totally heartwarming and worth the price of getting this book just to learn that they named beloved Joey Morella, they named the grandson, right? He's part of the twins.
Yes.
I think you
Yes.
said that, and that's really a big deal, tremendous deal. I have to find this photo of a mock scowling monsoon with Scoland at the Holland Hotel. George Napolitano told me, when we go there, this was like in '74, the first time going to ask for press for, ringside at Madison Square Garden. He goes, Arnie's not going to remember like any of us, even me and Apter when we, he goes, who are you? So he never knew if it was a work or a rib or legit. Like, who are you? You have to like re-remind him, oh, blah, blah, blah. Um, and Bully Ray, Bubba, who's, got all the big stuff going on. He loves like Tommy Dreamer. They just love history, biz history, big time, detailed biz history. And he always talks about like one of his proudest things was the thing he got to do as part of the Dudley Boys in WWE with Gino. That is a big part of Bully's heart, that he talks about a lot on the Busted Open 24/7 channel. But I wanted to ask, because few people know Bruno was promoting, I don't know why they don't know this, but he was allowed by Vince Senior to promote for X period of time in Pittsburgh. That's where Johnny DeFazio, John L. Sullivan, who later became Johnny Valiant of the tag team, and all those guys were there. But Gino promoting towns too.
Yes, yeah, and that promotion, it was like a satellite. It wasn't officially, at least in the beginning, it wasn't really part of, WWF Capital Wrestling, but later it wound up getting absorbed in that. But I know like Bruno had bought into it. I think he had gotten the shares that belonged to Toots Mondt originally, because it was Toots Mondt and Rudy Miller, and then Bruno got involved, and yeah, those were his towns. That's why yeah, and Gino would wrestle out there for Bruno. Gino, in those days, the Capital Territory was almost like a mini NWA. So you had different towns, different areas that were run by different people, but they would use the same talent that was booked out of New York and out of DC. So they carved it up. So like the Savoldis eventually wound up getting a big part of New England. Willie Gilzenberg was North Jersey. Arnie Skolin was in Westchester. Like we said, Bruno and Gino, where he was South Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware. That which is a nice chunk of geography. And those guys, when they ran those towns, like they lived or died by that. It wasn't like that was their show to run. They basically paid some kind of a booking fee to the office, and then the money that they made was their money. So it was all based off of the booking on television. Obviously, the good guys and bad guys, and they didn't have a million storylines like today, so it was much simpler to book. You get your title matches, your good guys, your bad guys, you bring them out, and based on their TV exposure, you draw a nice crowd, and that's really in those days where he made a lot of his money from those shows.
Well, very quickly, a little off topic, but on Roy Shire, who Gino was fond of, and cackled and telling me about Shire. I'm going to go fast. Screaming at talent when they blow a spot or something backstage, like Woody Farmer, who cried backstage after Shire did that. But Roy had come down for a couple of years and was co-hosting my TV show, and he would talk about some of Monsoon there. Hey, and
Sorry.
but I lost my train of thought. Let me throw over to Jonathan. That's what happens when you get to be 70.
All good. So you mentioned about the promotion in his part of the territory, Jersey, Delaware, Eastern Pennsylvania, etc. How much, I think it was something like 25% he had overall with the company, but how was he with the transition, because obviously we get to 82, 83-ish, and Vince Jr. buys into his owning a company and buying his dad and the partners out. So can you talk about that
Yeah, sure.
transition?
So it was originally 25%. And again, that was because of Toots Mondt retiring. The original ownership was Vince Sr. 50%, Toots Mondt 50%. They were equal partners. Toots retired in 1969. So they were looking to sell his shares, and there were a lot of potential buyers. Wild Red Berry was considered. He was kind of getting old and his health wasn't great. Bruno was considered, but Bruno didn't want it. Bruno didn't want to be in bed with those guys. He just didn't want to be that deep in there in the promotion. So what they wound up doing was they split it. So 25% went to Gorilla, who was only 32 years old at the time, and very, very trusted and very smart and respected. The other 25% went to Phil Zacco, who had been a loyal promoter, front man with them going back to the beginning of Capital Wrestling. Very loyal. And but by the time of Vince Jr. coming in, though, in the late 70s, that's when they cut in Arnold Skaaland. And basically, Zacco and Gorilla gave Arnie 5% each of theirs. So Arnie had 10% at that point. Gorilla had 20, Zacco had 20, and Vince Sr. had 50. Now, the thing was, and I get into this in the book, and it's probably one of the most surprising things in the book, is that Gorilla Monsoon was supposed to be the heir to the company. He was the guy that Vince Sr. had earmarked years before. He didn't even want his son to be anywhere near the business, let alone take over. Gorilla was the guy that he had pegged in mind. And so when the time came to get out, which he wanted to do in 81, 82, because he was part of it was he was just sick of it, just sick of the bullshit of locking horns with talent. He just didn't have the stomach for it in the end. And part of that too was also his health was failing. I don't know if he was aware, but he had pancreatic cancer at the time. I don't know if he knew yet, but he definitely knew he wasn't feeling so great. And so he wants to sell his 50%. So that's all he wanted to sell. So he's going to, there was a story that Buddy Rogers had interest of, believe it or not, because he had been back involved with the promotion again when Bruno left. But Buddy didn't have the kind of money that was needed. And so the next option that Vince Sr. really wanted to do was he said, look, I don't need another buyer. I'll just sell my 50% to my three partners, break it up. And so at that point, it would have been more like Gorilla 40, Zacco 40, Arnie 20. And you got Zacco, who's an old man, who's going to be kind of in the background. Arnie, a minority partner. And basically at that point, it would be Gorilla Monsoon's company. And so when the word is going around that that's what's in the wind, that's when Vince Jr. steps in and says, I don't want you to do that. I've got some backers and things you should sell to me. So he goes to his father first. And the idea is, okay, his father says, okay, I'll sell you my 50%. And that's when Vince goes, that's not really quite what I had in mind. I want 100%. So that's where it gets tricky, because everybody thinks it was this wonderful, harmonious transaction. It was not. They had to convince those guys. So now, he's got his dad on board. That gives him 50%. They had to really convince those guys. And out of the three of them, Gino was the one that took the most convincing, because he was the one who had the most to lose. Arnold Skaaland, loyal guy, not terribly ambitious. He was going to go along with things in the end. Zacco, like I said, old, looking to retire, looking to go home to live to Baltimore with his wife and take it easy, take the money and go home. Gino, the whole thing's going up in smoke, and he doesn't know. You got to remember too, this is hindsight's 2020. He doesn't know, is this going to work? The Vince Jr., not the best reputation at the time, kind of a screw up, a failure in business. And he thought, well, all this stuff that we worked for is now going to go up in smoke. So they had to convince him. And that's what took the convincing of him, which was like he wound up making more money than he ever made before, even though, of course, if he had held on to his 20%, he would have made infinitely more than that. But that was sort of the compromise that he had to make. It was either that or it was going to go into litigation, or he would have gotten pushed out, and then he would have wound up with nothing. So in the end, he made the best move he could possibly make under those circumstances.
Well, with that being said, With that being said, when did it click for him in terms of, and I know there's some stuff through the years that it was like, celebrity involvement, a couple of things that he may not agree with. But when would you say it clicked? He goes, okay, this thing might work.
I think it was pretty early, actually, because from what I understand, 82 and 83 were kind of rough years for him, where he was very disillusioned, very angry, unlike himself. And also in those years, he's leaning a lot more into Puerto Rico. For people that notice, he had supposedly retired in 1980, and he meant it. And he had stopped wrestling for the WWF. But in 82 and 83, he picks it up again in Puerto Rico, and he starts making appearances and wrestling again. And the idea was that's his plan B. If this WWF thing implodes, he's going to just hunker down in Puerto Rico and hang on to his 10% there and make that money. But by the time you get to 84, now you've got Hulk Hogan in place. They're doing 30 house shows a month, 3 a day sometimes in different markets. And part of the deal that Gorilla worked out, this was really the smart deal, was his pay was going to be 1.5 times opening match money on every show the WWF produced, whether he was there or not. Now, you can do the math on that, and you're talking about many hundreds of thousands of dollars that he's making at that point when the company is going everywhere and doing all these shows. So I think that was the point where he started to think, okay, this is going to be all right. Maybe, I don't have my ownership anymore, but I don't have to worry about money. Like, we're going to be fine, and I'm going to stick with this and be loyal and make as much as I can. But he took great pride in later years. He would brag to people about how he really squeezed Vince for everything he could get out of it. That the other guys kind of rolled over a little bit, but he really raked them over the coals to get the deal he wanted.
Absolutely. When did you said he retired in 80, at least in the WWF.
Yes.
When did the broadcasting become part of the deal with him?
It was almost immediately after he signed the papers in 82, because part of the deal was, in addition to the 1.5 times pay, it was, you got to keep me on TV. I'm not going to just fade into the background and be forgotten. I want to be a part of the show. And so the way they fit him in was they had him be the commentator. And so he started doing it in the fall of 82. And originally he was just doing the monthly house shows on cable. Like, he'd do MSG, he'd do the Spectrum. Later he would be doing the Cap Center. But by WrestleMania in 85, that's when they start trusting him with more big pay-per-views. By the summer of 85, he's doing the weekly television All-Star Wrestling, which becomes Wrestling Challenge. So
Prime Time.
Prime Time starts in actually January 85. But at first he's doing it with Jesse. And then later on, Bobby Heenan came in 86. Yeah.
Dr. Mike?
Oh, I've got some really quick ones too. His calls, I think, really helped that period of time we're talking about, the first couple of WrestleManias, like stuff just simply saying, like when Hogan went over Iron Sheik, Hulkamania has arrived. I mean, that really was heart and soul, and I think was so crucial in helping at that point. Monsoon I was on the board of WFIA after Don Wilson, the original president, left. I wasn't the president, but I was on the board immediately after he left, and that was like Cauliflower Alley. They would go to a different town. Well, it was different. They went to a different town every year, starting, I think, in 67 in Detroit. They came in for us. We had them in LA in 71. But at the 75 Boston WFA, Wrestling Fans International Association, where I co-ran, and we had a booth for the Blassie fan club, but I ran on my own the Tolis Brothers fan club. And don't forget the weird, what was it, 1965 heel tag team feud, Monsoon and Kowalski against the Tolis Brothers, trading Vince Sr.'s tag titles, which later somehow became the Tri-WF World Tag titles. And I'm doing the book on the Tollus brothers, and I'll be talking a lot about that. But first, you guys have to get this book on Monsoon. Monsoon and Ernie Roth were the only guys that came, like in all the other towns, like when we went to Atlanta and Kansas City and everywhere. All the talent would come in, the promoter and the talent would come in, like Dallas in '77. But Monsoon and Gino were welcomed as heroes, or Ernie Roth. They were the only ones that came to the 1975 Boston WFIA. Um, and Monsoon told me, I'm thinking of that 1991 and 92 NatB Television Syndicator Convention where WCW and WWF always had booths. Monsoon said one of his big regrets when they went national and all that stuff was that Ernie Roth was unable, he passed, so he wasn't able to be there for the Hulkamania and see how the company grew. And that was, just left field coming from him. But, it was telling how those guys were so loyal and, not all levels, but to each other. And then Monsoon in '73, I think it was August or September of '73, Johnny Valentine, Mike LaBelle had promoted in Los Angeles this huge dream match, even though they'd met already for Paul Boesch in Houston. Johnny Valentine against John Tolos had turned back heel as the Maniac John Tolos, and for like 5, 6 weeks he's promoting Valentine is coming in. Cowboy Rocky Valentine. He disdained that name Jules Strongbow gave him, but Johnny was coming in, and he came in and did TV at Channel 13 on the Saturday before the Olympic Auditorium show was going to happen 5 days later at the Olympic. He does 2 shots for Inoki in Japan. He gets a call from Mike LaBelle, who promised him the book. That's not happening. Johnny Valentine tells him to F himself. And this is like a day and a half before when it's supposed to be Valentine Tolos as the main event of all main events. Vince frantically makes the call to his pal, his close pal, which is the weirdest association, gentlemanly Vince Sr. with slimy Mike LaBelle, my boss. Vince Sr. sends him Gino, who has to do like a red-eye flight, comes, and it was emotional because he hadn't been in LA all those years. He gets this huge response when he walked out. Gigantic babyface pop, saved the show because otherwise, I mean, what are you going to do? There was nobody of Valentine's caliber there, and Gino made it to his credit. And, just what a great book, man. Congratulations on it. So needed. And I'll nag you. Vince Sr. next, please.
Yeah, you mentioned that one when you were talking at the beginning about some possibilities.
Or your dog right there.
And I'll say the same thing when we were talking about the gorilla thing years ago, was like I said then, I like the idea. I love writing about wrestling history, but I'm also always concerned about finding a readership. And so it's tough. You want to find somebody that checks off those boxes, and Gorilla Monsoon's one of those because everybody knows who that is. The interesting thing about Vince Sr. now is because of the Vince Jr. connection and all that's known about Vince, the current Vince today, and all the curiosity about Vince, that I think there's increased curiosity about Vince's father and what that contributed to who Vince is today. So I actually think there'd be more interest in a Vince McMahon Sr. book right now than ever before. So I'm not saying I'm doing it. I'm not saying I'm doing it. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, you can tell Junior's story within it.
Right.
So you're going to have people all over the globe that will want that one, as they will this one, because in Japan alone, I want to see buys big time because of his history there, and they love history there, like Toronto, Montreal, all these history, Chicago, all these amazing history towns around the world. They're going to love this book. The whole planet is.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I don't want to keep Brian all day, but two things with the book, and make sure you go get it. We'll have Amazon and ECW Press links to it. But what do you think Gorilla's legacy is overall? But also with the book, getting some guy named Bret Hart to do the forward. So
yeah,
we talk on both of those.
We kind of buried the lead, right? So the Bret Hart thing, I mentioned Tom Burke before. I'm partly grateful to Tom because Tom made the introduction to me to Ross Hart, who's Bret Hart's brother and he's kind of the historian of the Hart family, and he also, is a big. He was on my podcast, and we got to talking about this project, and I wound up interviewing him for it. And he told me about how close the Hart family was with Gorilla, which I didn't fully understand at the time. I didn't get it, how deep the ties were. And so Ross said, you should talk to my brother Brett about this. And I was like, yes, I agree. Can you help me with that? And he put me in touch with Brett. And originally it was just going to be an interview for the book, just like I did with Ross. But we got to talking, and I got to thinking. And when I started seeing how close they were, and also how well-known and respected Brett is in the business, I asked him to write the foreword, and he jumped at it. I mean, he was all about it. He wrote something which is so effective and real and from his heart. And I'm so grateful to him for doing that. But as far as the legacy of Gorilla Monsoon, I mean, there's a couple of things. One is that's so important is he was a cornerstone of what is now the most successful, the biggest, the most well-known professional wrestling company in the history of the entire business. And he was a foundational cornerstone that is not talked about enough. His value, the role that he played, it's not discussed enough. And I think also part of the legacy too, obviously there's the gorilla position, which people know about today, even if they don't even know where the name comes from, which is sad. And I hope this book will fix that problem. But, and the other part is that he was an example of somebody who rose to the highest levels of the business and became universally respected while still being a good and decent and honorable man, which we know is very rare in the wrestling business.
Yes.
He wasn't a backstabber. He wasn't a stooge. He wasn't ruthless or cruel. He wasn't he was an educated family man. He was loyal to his wife. He was universally praised. And it's proof that you can achieve great things in wrestling without being a dirtbag or a lowlife or a two-faced predator, right? So I think it's a very positive legacy.
Well, you mentioned the closeness with the Hart family, and it just clicked for me listening to you. And that being, I don't think many people notice, is there was a phone call between Stu and Gorilla after Owen's tragedy. Did that make the book, or can you talk about where Gino eventually said, Stu, I'm sorry, whatever the conversation has, because Gino to a fault was loyal.
Yeah, so the phone call between Stu Hart and Gorilla Monsoon when Owen died, I'm surprised that you knew about that, because it is in the book, but I found out about it from Valerie. And so when Owen died, and again, people don't think about Gorilla as being around for these things, but he was. So Owen died May 1999, over the edge. Gorilla was in poor health, but still involved with the company, still coming out. And he knew the Harts going back to 1961. And Owen wasn't even born then. I think he first got to know Owen when the company was expanding into Calgary in the 80s. But, when it happened and the Harts were, Stu and Martha and them were trying to mount this lawsuit, right? So they reached out to Gino, who they knew all these years. And Gino, actually, Valerie said that Valerie was watching the show or something, or found out about it. And she woke her father up and told him what had happened. And he started crying immediately. Mm-hmm. And he had gotten on the phone with Stu. And you got to remember, they both lost their sons to the wrestling business in horrible, tragic ways that never should have happened, not even in the standard, typical ways. And so they had this bond, but they talked and they cried. But then when it came to the point of Stu saying, look, you could be very valuable here. You're a very important person in that company. Would you help us? Would you help us with this lawsuit that we're trying to do? And that's where he had to draw the line and say, I feel for you very deeply, and I know what you're going through, but, this is the company I work for. And Valerie said he even said something to the effect of, this is our business. This is the business we chose. which
almost like a mafia type of deal.
Yes, but it's an interesting thing to say because yes, it's the business we chose, but I don't think anybody foresaw getting lowered down from the ceiling on a cable when you got into it. But nevertheless, that is what he said, something to that effect. And I'm not going to, I can't do that. I can't cross that line. But he was very, very affected by Owen's death for sure.
Mike, do you have anything before we put a bow on things?
I just want to see in the new vignette that I don't know what the term for it's called. I'll ask Ben Brown at WWE, but the opening, montage here or past, present, future. Now all they have from our past is, one single brief shot of Bruno. I wish they had Monsoon, Rogers, the Graham brothers, who nobody talks about. Maybe that's another book after Vince Sr.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you one thing actually in the good news department. So when I don't know if you saw this, but when they premiered on ESPN, when they did WrestlePalooza, they brought out a whole new opening montage. So this was just a couple of weeks ago. It's totally new, completely redone, much better actually. I didn't like the one they'd been using for a while where it was all pixelated. You couldn't really see who was who. So they got a brand new one. And in the opening, I mean, obviously everything goes by so fast, but in the opening moments of it, the first screen, one of the pictures tiled on the screen is Gorilla Monsoon in his wrestling gear. It's the first time Gorilla has been a part of the montage in years. And I'm not saying, I'm just going to say, I find it hard to believe that's a coincidence, that it's right as this book is coming out and awareness about Gorilla and his role are being raised. And if I had even the slightest bit to play in that decision being made, I'm very proud. Now, the next thing I got to do is get him in Dave's Hall of Fame, and then I'll really be happy.
Yes, which he was.
He's not in Meltzer. Wait, he's not in Meltzer's Hall of Fame yet?
No. In fact, he dropped off the ballot in 2015. And they put him back on this year because of the book to see what would happen.
Back to the vignette. I think I've been fast forwarding too much. What I would like to see, though, is an identifier. Maybe, as brief as they flash those shots in succession, is like have it spelled out. Gorilla Monsoon, Jerry and Eddie Graham, Bobby Davis, Buddy Rogers, whomever, Tolis Brothers. I wish they would have that. If you're really going to do past, present, future in the vignette, then really oomph up the past. Obviously the company wouldn't be around without Bruno and Monsoon. So everybody, you are going to love this book. It should be a treasured part. I mean, with the Sheik book, wow. Knockout, two knockouts after another. So congratulations to you and more success. And I know you're going to have a blast. Hey, could you see yourself doing book signings in Japan? You're going to get a reception there like crazy if that's possible.
I would love to. If they cover my travel expenses, I would be thrilled to do it for sure. In a heartbeat. Are you kidding?
I'll email you on that because
I'm
doing more work than ever, mostly for Japan, more so than PWI. So
what's next for Brian? What's next for you? Obviously, you're still promoting the book, but what are we seeing coming down the line?
Well, I did 3 books in a row right on top of each other. People may not know. I squeezed one in between Sheik and Monsoon. It's not a wrestling book. It was a book about superheroes and comic books, but they were overlapping where I was actually working on more than one at a time on certain occasions. And so I really just kind of wanted to let this one run its course, take a breath, rest. The past year, I haven't been really intensively book writing. I've been writing other things. So I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of ideas. I may do something that's non-wrestling related next. I may do something more personal. I've wanted to do a story about my family. I come from an immigrant family, to do kind of like a family memoir or something like that. But I'll always be coming back to wrestling. And if I do, I've had a few ideas. I've thought about doing a Rocca biography for a while. I thought that would be an interesting one. Especially because when you think about the wrestling style of today, I mean, the Thezes of the world would have turned over in their grave, but I would have to say Rocca is the most influential guy from that period on the wrestling of today, and as far as the style of working. He was like the only guy doing that stuff in 1950, and now everybody does that stuff. You can't even call yourself a wrestler if you can't do those things. So I thought that would be interesting, but I also have this great idea. And Mike, if I do this, I'm going to have you on speed dial because I've wanted to do this, but it's an expensive book to produce. I want to do a big coffee table art book on wrestling magazines. Like the way they've done it for Playboy, they've done it for comic books, they do it for those. I want to do, the heyday, 50s, the second half of the 20th century, basically, 60s, 70s, 80s, the heyday of wrestling magazines, talk to all the players that are still around, all the bloody spreads, the covers, everything, the apartment wrestling. I want to do it all. But that you can't do that as a little book. That's got to be a big, heavy book. And it costs a lot of money to make, as ECW Press very politely let me know. So I don't know if it'll ever be a possibility, but it's a dream that I want to do.
Well, that would be like Theo Ehret's book. Actually,
Yes,
he had two that were
yes.
huge, gigantic ones. The Rocca book is genius because Cola Corny, I'm probably screwing up the name of his handler, so-called manager, that guy was a character alone in Rocca's life.
Yeah.
But and I wanted to ask you, Crypto stole the picture, the latest Superman picture. Yes, no. Crypto,
Agreed.
and
Yes.
it wasn't even a real dog.
No, I know. I was just talking to my wife about it. I don't think for a single frame it was ever a real dog. It was completely CGI, but very well done. Yeah, we loved that movie. We loved it, but I got to tell you, the Fantastic Four, I think I liked even more. That was just, if you love, classic Marvel era 60s Marvel, it was like they brought it to life.
But that was
Very
such a
fun.
great period to comic books. What, they went from 5 cents to 12 cents, and they had to have that seal of approval, whether it
Yeah.
was DC or Marvel. What a period for comics, and then the Batman TV show, which you talk about marking out, forget about wrestling. We were marking out Wednesday, Thursdays for the Batman TV show on ABC.
I bet. I used to watch it in repeats as a kid. I was obsessed with it. Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah.
But
Wow.
we should mention as we close his the podcast and all that fun stuff. So where can people find you, Brian?
Sure. Well, my podcast is Shut Up and Wrestle with Brian R. Solomon, and it's a wrestling history podcast. So when I have rotating guests every week, the guests determine what the topic's going to be. So it's an interesting listen. It's part of the Arcadian Vanguard Network, which is where Jim Cornette's shows are. I'm grateful to Brian Last for that. You can find it wherever you get podcasts. There's a Facebook group associated with it. There's a Patreon, patreon.com/shutupandwrestle, where I've got lots of additional content. And if people want to find me on social media, it's Brian R. Solomon on Twitter and Instagram.
Absolutely. Brian, thank you so much. Appreciate the time and congratulations on such a great book.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Combate curas.
Hey folks, looking for the ultimate destination for the nerd enthusiasts and collectors? Well, we found the spot for you. Nerds Nest Collectibles is a haven for nerds, geeks, and fans alike, as they have many different products and certainly more to come. Make sure you go ahead and visit them at nerdsnestcollectibles.com. Check them out.
Hi, this is Baby Doll. You're a perfect 10. And whenever you want to hear the best about wrestling, memories, stories, whatever we have to say, listen to Crazy Train Radio. They've got it all.